Hello, and welcome back to Readapted, where we take a work and explore why we keep telling the same story over and over and over. I'm your host, Chris Pepper-Hambrick. This entire season, we've been looking at The Phantom of the Opera, and the way it morphed into a many-headed masked menace. By now, we've covered silent cinema, universal horror, Brian De Palma's brand of counterculture, and multiple romantic musical retellings. Today, we'll be taking a step to the side, as horror reasserts itself. Was it backlash or course correction? I'll leave that up to you to decide, but either way, the shift was definite, fascinating, but arguably temporary. A few things before we get started. The only way for this show to get heard is for people to hear about it, so if you've been enjoying these discussions, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, review, and tell your friends. I've really appreciated the notes I've gotten from those of you who've taken the time to reach out. Second, I've made a few errors in the past few episodes I'd like to correct. First, in episode 7, I somehow mixed up Richard Corliss and William Tynan articles and used Tynan's name when I quoted Corliss. Also, when I previewed this episode, I said Brad Little was the director of the 1989 Robert Englund film, when I meant Dwight Little. I probably said Brad Little because, well, he's the actor with the record for the longest-running Phantom in the Lloyd Webber musical with over 2,000 performances. So I wasn't pulling that name entirely out of thin air, but I do apologize to both Brad and Dwight. I also want to mention, for those of you who plan to watch the films mentioned here and haven't yet, that they both have fairly gruesome imagery, and the Argento film definitely needs a warning about sexual consent. I'm not going to be getting graphic myself here, but please take whatever steps you need to protect yourself. With that housekeeping aside, let's look at what happened in the heady days after multiple musicals seemed to have solidified the Phantom as a romantic lead. In 1989 and 1998, 3 different films came out that, while seeming to have very little to do with the blockbuster musical, nevertheless serve as a sort of rebuttal to the floridly romantic place the Phantom was taking in pop culture. They were, in 1989, Dwight Little's Phantom of the Opera starring Robert Englund and The Phantom of the Mall, Eric's Revenge, and, in 1998, Dario Argento's Phantom of the Opera with Julian Sands and Asia Argento. None of these movies was well reviewed, though in the intervening years, the first, the Robert Englund film, has accrued some favorable cult attention. None is actually very good, though again, the first one has some very enjoyable elements. But the two that don't take place in a shopping complex, at the very least contribute to and complicate the conversation we've been having about Phantom in general. In particular, this episode is a good time to talk about genre. We all, as consumers of stories, have some instinctive understanding of genre. It's pretty easy to tell most of the time whether you're watching a romance or a horror movie. And we all recognize the various styles or tropes that make up those genres. It would be very jarring, for example, for a romantic comedy to end in death, or for an action-adventure movie to turn into a romance between the combatants, though frankly I would watch either of those movies. Famously, subverting or combining tropes can be highlighted as kind of the point, as in the Robert Rodriguez-Quentin Tarantino film From Dusk Till Dawn, which morphs from crime drama into a vampire flick. Or something like Shaun of the Dead, which uses comedy to spoof the zombie subgenre. But most of the time, genre is more or less invisible, in the sense that we don't tend to question it once the rules have been established. You accept violence in a vampire movie in a way you would not necessarily in a romance. As we've talked about when discussing the novel, Phantom of the Opera doesn't entirely fit the bill of either horror or romance, given that Eric doesn't easily slot into a two-dimensional gothic monster space, and the moral lesson is slightly more nuanced, at least for its time. And we've seen how the various adaptations have struggled somewhat with this fact, as when the Universal execs failed to grasp that you could make a movie where the monster finds redemption. This, for them, violated the genre rules, despite the fact that nothing like what we now call the horror genre even existed in film yet. Thus, we have the reshot ending where Eric does not, in fact, let Christine go and dies a villain. And as we've seen in subsequent film tellings, the shift of the Phantom to victim means that his actions play as a revenge tragedy, a genre with inherently more sympathy and moral ambiguity available to the perpetrator. The shift in the Lloyd Webber musical to a more romantic tone is a kind of genre shift from previous films, in that the tropes of romance now shape plot and character decisions, as well as the audience's reaction, or at least the response the creators seem to want or assume you to have. You can certainly have horror elements in your romance, just as you can have romance or comedy in an action film, but the thematic and stylistic elements used generally point towards a given feeling or interpretation. Without this, an audience may be left in confusion as to how they are supposed to feel. A man standing outside a woman's window could be Michael Myers, or it could just be John Cusack with a boombox, but a film generally gives you cues about whether this behavior is romantic or creepy. Genres, of course, go through phases, both in their relative popularity and in terms of subgenre. Gerald Hogel, in The Undergrounds of the Phantom of the Opera, even postulates that one of the reasons we didn't see a direct Phantom film adaptation for decades was the shift in cultural anxiety to the nuclear threat, rendering the traditional Gothic villain obsolete. And while it is certainly true that horror tends to mirror society's current fears, the proliferation of phantoms as a primarily romantic story indicates that it was suited to the times, just not as a horror film. Other stories have changed genre or tone upon being adapted to a new medium. I mean this as distinct from story elements or even endings being changed by Hollywood. For example, the Stanley Kubrick film Dr. Strangelove, a primary example of film satire, is based on a book called Red Alert by Peter George, which is a straightforward thriller about the dangers of nuclear war. The book provided the broad plot outlines, but in adapting it, Kubrick was increasingly attracted to its potential for dark comedy. The Shakespeare play The Tempest was essentially adapted for science fiction in 1956's The Forbidden Planet, though that's uncredited, and both can still be called adaptations of that original source material, despite the liberties taken. And as we've already talked about, something like The Shape of Water could be seen as a loose adaptation of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, played as a romance drama. In the case of Phantom, of course, it wasn't a matter of forcing the source material into a new horror shape. But I would argue that given the journey it had already been on, and the changes in horror between the first days of film and the 1980s, the emergence of these movies does represent a new take on the story, because that angle had been more or less subsumed for so long. So, starting with the Dwight Little film, released in 1989, how did it get made, and how does it fit in the context of both the horror genre and the Phantom story? Horror in the 1980s was a very different beast than it had been just 15 or 20 years before. The rating system implemented in 1968 replaced decades of Hollywood self-censorship and meant that films could be made that were not intended for viewing by the whole family. This opened up opportunities for sex, gore, language, violence, and adult themes. The rise of blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars meant that genre films were increasingly seen as viable moneymakers. And the boom in home video meant that films could be produced that were never intended for the theater or big box office receipts. It was a viable game plan to produce a slasher film on the cheap, send it directly to Blockbuster or late-night cable, and still recoup a profit. And that leads us to changes within the genre itself. As we've talked about before, genre movies, like horror and sci-fi, tend to tap into a culture's contemporary concerns and fears more than almost any other genre. The 70s and 80s saw a lot fewer movies about atomic horrors or gothic monsters, and a ton of movies about, well, slashing. While Psycho and Peeping Tom in 1960 both prefigure a lot of the themes of these films, and Italy's Giallo films get going in the 60s and 70s, it's with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street that we really saw the genre take off in America. Unlike other brands of horror, the slasher involves a human protagonist who, through some trauma or wrong done to him, and it's usually a him, has gone beyond the bounds of traditional morality and become a psychotic killer, bent on venting his trauma on the world. The danger lurks in your very neighborhood, in the hidden darkness of the people around you. By 1989, the recent popularity of horror was waning, as illustrated in the following list of other horror releases from that year: Amityville 4, The Fly 2, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, Halloween 5, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, Silent Night, Deadly Night 3, and Warlock. This is not, of course, every horror film that came out that year, but it's every horror film on Wikipedia I could find that I actually recognized. And aside from Warlock, which is special for its own reasons, they are all sequels and mostly threequels or later, all fairly tired takes on trying to shock us yet again. While Dwight Little's Phantom is neither a sequel nor a direct response to another film, there are ways in which it falls into this category of cheap genre rehash, and ways in which it does not. From the producer Menahem Golan's standpoint, it was meant to be a quickie picture made on the cheap because the LaRue book had entered public domain. Because he'd just made a film in Budapest that took place in London, and had the set still built, he figured that, plus a famous title, would be enough to go on. It was originally written by Jerry O'Hara and set for John Howe to direct, but the production company Cannon went bankrupt. Golan formed a new company, 21st Century Film Corporation, which for some reason decided the film would have a sequel in the present day, and thus demanded rewrites to include the bookending scenes in New York. Directorial duties passed to Dwight Little, who tapped Duke Sandifer to do rewrites. Sandifer read the book and watched the other film versions and then, according to him, used none of them. Quote, I wanted to be true to the book rather than go back and remake a movie that's been remade many times before. The sequel, of course, was never made, though Englund claims the script was even better. One thing they say they did not look at was the musical, which is entirely possible given that it debuted on Broadway in 1988 and perhaps had not permeated the entire culture at that point they were working on the film. Says Sandifer, "We decided altogether, everyone, not to have any contact with that and not to see the musical before the film." Unquote. This included the composer, Misha Siegel. Robert Englund collaborated with Little and with makeup artist Kevin Yeager on the mood and look of the thing. It was, in Englund's mind, a way to get away from the Freddy Krueger typecasting, though, ironically, the poster and cover for the film depict him in basically Freddy makeup with the words, "Was Freddy," right next to his face. The team went back to the Faustian themes of the novel, making a deal with the devil explicit in their version and Eric's face a consequence of his choice of art over love, a choice he's ultimately not satisfied with, as we'll see. The film opens with a made-up quote about how those who sell their souls to Satan will be damned to relive that wretched life through all times. This is to set up the present-day framing device and to justify Eric still being around for a would-be sequel 100 years after the action of the first film. What this actually does is make the beginning play a little bit like fanfiction, where the writer's self-insert goes back in time to have a romance with the Phantom, but this is certainly accidental. 80s Christine finds a piece of old sheet music by someone named Eric Dessler called Don Juan Triumphant with the help of her friend Meg, played by Molly Shannon in her first film role. Hallucinating that the notes are running with blood, she nevertheless decides to use the piece in an audition, which she nails, but unfortunately suffers a concussion during, as a sandbag falls on her head. Waking up in the 1880s in London, with her friend Meg now disappointingly not at all Molly Shannon, we get into the real meat of the story, which follows essentially the beats of the original. For a while. There is a Carlotta who is terrorized by the Phantom and replaced triumphantly by Christine. There is a boyfriend, named Richard here, to whom Christine is also drawn. But beyond that, the R rating, the recent pedigree of slasher films, and the notion to go back to the idea of a Faustian bargain really show their weight. In this world, Eric, looking like a handsomer version of Robert Englund actually, explicitly did make a deal with the devil, the price of which was the ruination of his face such that, yes, he will be loved for his music, but only for his music. This confers not only immortality, but a more explicit kind of amorality on the character, who isn't reacting simply out of his rejection by society. He's able to kill with impunity because he knows that not only is he basically immortal, his soul is damned anyway. The form this takes in the film is that both the violence and the sex are more explicit than we've seen previously. The murders are gruesome, involving skinning and beheadings and really bad Freddy-like quips. The upside, for me anyway, is that we get a truly inspired situation wherein Eric is skinning people and then using that skin to make a patchwork temporary mask for himself, basically my favorite thing about the movie. In terms of sex, we have a fully sexual and sexualized Phantom here. It's not hinted at. This Eric, though living and lurking in the basement, is actually also integrated with at least some level of society, visiting taverns and taking prostitutes to bed, whom he insists on calling Christine. His interest in Christine, and hers in him, is clearly meant to be not just in terms of music, and this is obvious not simply in the way she responds to him, but in the way the makeup wants the audience to respond. Englund and Yeager made Eric, in the flashback and even in many of the masked sequences, intentionally hot. Anecdotal evidence gathered by yours truly from various internet forums supports the thesis that this was, indeed, successful. Along with the added interest of a Faustian bargain and sex workers, there's a fun subplot involving a corrupt opera critic who bows to Carlotta's demand that he tank Christine's career, which justifies his own gruesome and untimely end. Bill Nye completely owns the screen in his small role as the opera house owner. And then there's the odd conversation between Richard and a detective about how it's actually known that Eric Dessler is committing these atrocities, but no one can do anything because he can only be destroyed through his music, though it's never explained how this became common knowledge. Unfortunately for Sexy Freddy Eric, he pushes things too far when, in the final confrontation with Christine and Richard in the underground lair, he lights Christine's boyfriend on fire. Considering the literally thousands of candles that make up the majority of the decor, this was probably always going to happen, but this proves Christine's breaking point. She lights the lair on fire and escapes, somehow or other, back into the present by shattering a mirror, an interesting reversal of the usual journey through the mirror sequence. In the present day, her audition has gone well, though everyone's concerned about the mysterious accident. As a result, the opera producer insists on taking her home to talk about her career, and it turns out he's actually Eric Dessler, now with a much more sophisticated synthetic skin. Realizing it wasn't all a dream after all, Christine attempts to destroy his music, But in the last scene, she passes by a street violinist playing Don Juan triumphant, thus setting us up for the non-existent sequel. This movie is worth watching for fans of Phantom or Robert Englund, and I do get the sense from the performances and interviews that the people involved were devoted to making something interesting. Little and Sandifer talk about wanting to go back to the text and pull out something darker. Jill Schoelen is an earnest Christine, and as a singer herself, clearly made an effort to make the singing look accurate, even if she was dubbed. And Englund, seeing it as a way out of Freddy, had a big hand in his portrayal. In his words, "I wanted to play the horror real, but I wanted to play the romantic part a little kicked up." But the end result, while having now attained some cult status, doesn't quite add up for me. I believe this to be the fault of both internal and sort of external factors. What I mean is, the original brief from producer Golan was to make a film quickly and cheaply. This clearly works against what I believe to be the sincere attempts the cast and crew made to create something interesting and new. And while there are a few interesting developments here, the end product comes off as somewhat stuck. Both Schoelen and makeup artist Yeager were disappointed that the finished film looked like a slasher film, indicating this was not what they, at least, were going for. And from interviews with Little, Sandifer, and Englund, it seems safe to say that's not really what they were going for either. I think the problem is that in attempting to meld the sex and the horror, it fell in between worlds, in Schoelen's words, and satisfied no one. Despite Englund's intentions, the horror doesn't come off as real, and the romance is maybe a bit too kicked up. In terms of audience, perhaps the horror aficionados were not interested in the efforts at over-the-top love story, and the people who liked the darkly romantic elements were maybe turned off by the violence going too far. There's a certain cognitive dissonance in having your would-be devilish but romantic lead also skin people alive and quip, "You're suspended," when hanging people to death. This, I think, has nothing to do with the premise of casting your scarred villain as a love interest. I think plenty of people are willing to see Eric Dessler as darkly desirable. But I also think that this particular script works against that reading for a lot of people, simply because it goes past dangerous and into gross. It's one thing to be attracted to the ugly guy who sold his soul to the devil. It's another to maintain that attraction when he's putting people's heads in the soup. In the end, I can see what they were trying to do, and I appreciate that attempt, but ultimately I think it's a failure, mostly of tone and genre. They needed to have either stuck with one mode or do a better job of finessing the join, and they simply did not have the time or perhaps the skill to do it. I want to take a moment here to specify that this is not to say I think it's a failure of adaptation. I believe the issues are in execution, not necessarily the concept, though your mileage may vary. In the press, it got one favorable review that I can find, but later found a little more support in video rental, and is remembered well enough that many online fans use the last name Dessler for Eric to this day. Sadly, the same fandom nostalgia cannot be claimed for our next feature, Dario Argento's 1998 Mess, starring the late Julian Sands and Asia Argento. Spoiler alert, this is by far the least loved and possibly most loathed adaptation we'll be covering, because I'm not counting sequels. And yes, we are going to talk about that next episode. This is unfortunate, especially given Sands' recent death, which was tragic, and my heart goes out to his family. He leaves behind an incredible body of work and a unique career. This film falls squarely on the unique side of that, however. The Argento film was by no means fated to be hated. Argento had a long and respected career in the 1970s and 80s, influencing many other directors and the genre in general with his brand of giallo horror. Giallo is a subgenre of Italian origin, which in many ways prefigured and influenced the American slasher films of the 80s, though it's one of those things that's hard to define. Generally, they're slick but gory, murder mysteries that rely on psychological horror and thriller elements, a combination which would show up soon after in films like Halloween, while the eroticism would have its day later with the rise of thrillers like Basic Instinct. But from what I can tell online, there's a fairly wide consensus among Argento fans that Phantom is what convinced them he'd lost his touch. I've been unable to find much about the making of the film, beyond an interview with Julian Sands in which he expresses his excitement at working with Argento, a, quote, world-class cineast. He was also intrigued by the challenge to present a phantom as having a bestial nature and a noble human nature that was forever in conflict, which is a lovely thought, but, well, I guess I've put up talking about the plot long enough. It's hard to know exactly what I should include in this plot summary, since the film is made up of several subplots that don't do much except make the film increasingly uncomfortable to watch. It opens with what looks like a direct recreation of the opening of Batman Returns, with a baby in a basket floating through the sewers, only he's rescued not by penguins, but by rats. This child, raised by rats, grows up to be Julian Sands in a very long blonde wig. The notable thing to remember here is that this person is in no way physically marred, disfigured, or physically disabled. He looks like Julian Sands in what I think is meant to be a sexy wig and a poofy low-cut blouse. However, we are introduced to the adult Phantom when he very gorily murders 3 men doing maintenance in the sewer, presumably because they are close to his domain. He kills a lot of people in this film, sometimes with, well, his teeth. Because, rats. In fact, at one point he even states, "I'm not a phantom, I'm a rat." When we next see him, he's approaching Christine in the hallway of the opera, after she's performed on an empty stage in a see-through dress. Despite his upfront approach, he is somehow far more creepy than previous phantoms hiding behind mirrors managed to be, but Christine seems pretty turned on by the notion that their relationship will be their little secret, and she'll hear his thoughts and know where to go to meet him. So they're telepathic now, I guess. They proceed almost directly into a sexual relationship, though she's also seeing Raoul, who inexplicably looks like a vampire. What follows is an incoherent mess that involves a lot of sex filmed by the father of the main actress, a rapist phantom, and extended subplots about pedophile managers, rat catchers, and a Turkish bath/whorehouse. The phantom says things like, "Your perfume, your feminine smell throws through my veins like the melody of the rolling ocean." And also, "I was abandoned at birth on the river of time and space, but I was nurtured by creatures." They're rats, dude. The creatures are rats. His emotions are extremely volatile, and he turns on Christine immediately once she shows a shred of doubt about living underground with rats. But for her part, she is also unable to figure out what she wants, and even after learning he's an abusive rapist with unusual rat-centered proclivities, she seems upset to be leaving him with Raoul and more upset that he dies. The thing is, if I could discern a reason for these changes and additions, it would be one thing. There's a place, somewhere, for examining whether the Phantom's ugliness is physical or internal. There's also, I'm sure, a place for exploring a world where he is not the only ugly soul, but merely one in a society full of pedophiles and other grotesques. Or even in questioning the ability of any human to be moral in an immoral universe. Unfortunately, this movie fails to actually say anything about anything, so the gore, the sex, the violence, and the shock all comes off here merely to titillate. Except it doesn't do that unless Julian Sands shoving rats down his pants does it for you. Even the scenes with the very sexy Asia Argento can't help but be marred by the audience, or this audience anyway, being intensely conscious the whole way through that her father is the director. On top of that, the production is so cheap-looking, the sets and costumes a hodgepodge of whatever was in someone's backstage closet, that I found myself distracted by the Halloween pop-up store look of all of it. Not to mention some pretty hideously computer-animated sequences that I think are meant to be the Phantom's fantasies. The early Giallo films by Argento, Mario Bava, and others are not for everyone, and there are many valid critiques of their lurid goriness, lack of realism, and perceived misogyny. But what held them together and made it a viable and critically acclaimed genre was their stylishness. They were aesthetic masterpieces which thrilled and titillated, often demonstrating the strong imprint of individual creators. Think about the spaghetti westerns of Sergio Leone, who was operating around the same time. They didn't need to be expensive or deep to be stylish, exciting, and successful. Indeed, Argento made a movie just 10 years before Phantom, called Opera, which is beautifully shot, hangs together, and is just as gory and sexy as this film seems to be trying to be. The contrast between Opera and Phantom is mystifying, which is especially ironic given that Opera is about, well, an opera singer with a murderous stalker. I do believe there is room, in a pantheon which includes Lon Chaney and Gerard Butler, for a strictly stylish Phantom, a slick thriller that doesn't really question the social norms Gaston Leroux explored in his novel. It probably wouldn't be my favorite version, but then again, I'm a big fan of Phantom of the Paradise, so who am I to say? But this movie is not that. In a very different way from the Dwight Little film, it fails to deliver on a premise of style over substance. While the 1989 movie is an imperfect balance of genre and style that ends up falling short. Argento's film nearly 10 years later is so lost that, having watched it at least 4 times now, I have even less of an idea what he was going for than I did the first time. That's what this movie does to you. Ultimately, I don't think the Argento film says as much about Italian or Western culture in the 90s, so much as Argento's fall from artistic grace. But while both films fail to really deliver, though in my opinion in very different ways, I don't think either is merely an attempt to cash in, even if one of them may explicitly have started out that way. Or even if they were meant to be, they still contribute something to the narrative arc I'm trying to create over this entire season. First, since our last film in 1983, the Made in Hungary TV movie starring Maximilian Schell and Jane Seymour, we've seen a radical shift in how films are distributed, which contributes to what films can get made and how they are seen. That is to say, home video has made films financially viable that would not necessarily have been so if they'd been reliant on box office. I cannot say for sure that these two would not have been made without the VHS and DVD options to pad out the profits, but in general, it made financing cheaper, faster movies easier. And here's where I have to mention, ever so briefly, 1989's The Phantom of the Mall, Eric's Revenge. Despite the fact that it was actually released in theaters, it very much looks and acts like a direct-to-video movie. In today's terms, something you come across on Tubi that you click on because you're high. If you can think of anything more aggressively 80s than a cheap slasher about a teenage phantom in a shopping mall, please let me know what that is. Certainly there was schlock in previous decades, but it's not until the video era that you get enough of it for ripoffs like this to seem like a profitable idea. As a side note, as of 2021, you can buy this film on DVD with 4 different cuts, so save your pennies. Getting back to our 2 main movies and our point the second, both films combine elements of horror and sex in a way we have not seen in previous versions, even with Brian De Palma at the helm or songs like Music of the Night being obvious code for sex. For all De Palma would go in for this sort of thing in the 80s, his 70s output is a lot more focused on psychological and sociological horror. And the musical versions eschew most of the horror and go straight for romance or family drama. Little and Argento are both making horror films, in a way not even the Lon Chaney or Claude Rains films were. But they're making horror films with the added element of sex, which was made possible by the advent of the Motion Picture Association of America's rating system. Once directors could start adding sexual, violent, or linguistic spice to their films, they began exploring just how, and in many ways slasher horror is a prime example of the potency of that blend. These 2 films aren't moving the needle, but they are an example of the difference in what it was possible to show on screen by the late 1980s and 90s. And you could argue that by combining sex and horror, they're actually getting closer to the lurid roots of the genre LaRue was ostensibly working in, even if gothic horror and romance was a lot less explicit back then. Like it or not, the movies managed to do something new and different with the material. They increase the adult content and add back in the horror that's arguably been largely missing. And in the case of the Robert Englund film, whatever liberties they take, they use Don Juan Triumphant and the Faust narrative in unique and, I think, compelling ways. In terms of the aesthetics of the Phantom himself, I think in both films we see reflected some confusion in the culture around ugliness and deformity. In the novel, as in the Lon Chaney film, Eric appears to have been born that way. In subsequent versions, including Song at Midnight, Phantom of the Paradise, and the Claude Rains, Herbert Lom, and Maximilian Schell versions, he was betrayed and received his scars as a result of that betrayal. In the Kopit Yestin and Lloyd Webber musicals, again we return to a phantom with some form of congenital condition affecting his appearance. But Englund and Sands each take a vastly different tack. As we spoke about in the episodes about the Lloyd Webber musical, the conversation around physical anomalies and the disabled had changed by the 1980s, though not perfectly. The media was much more inclined to demonstrate compassion, and physical ugliness was not always a signifier of evil or malice. When it was, in the case of someone like Freddy Krueger, the physical ugliness was an outward manifestation of his inner sin, but had happened as a direct result of his evil deeds. But characters in Beauty and the Beast, Mask, and The Elephant Man existed in order to demonstrate that you cannot judge people by their appearance. The Englund Phantom does more or less harken back to Freddy, both in the makeup itself and in the fact that it's an external mark of a choice he made to sin. While more his fault maybe than the outright betrayed phantoms, their injuries are also the result of choices they all made, however indirectly or unfairly. But the utter lack of attempt to make Julian Sands ugly, bad wig notwithstanding, should be interesting to us. And what seems to be an attempt to make him actually kinda hot while also being a monster is unfortunately more interesting than the film has any interest in actually exploring. One gets the sense that the decision not to mar his face had more to do with budget, laziness, or the desire to film sexy scenes with Miss Argento without distracting the audience with an ugly dude, rather than the desire to contribute anything new to the conversation. I can definitely see wanting to tell a tale about a man who thinks he's been rejected from society, but it's his own perception that has led him to this conclusion. Sadly, Argento chose because he was raised by rats and lives in a world of darkness as his backstory. And there's really not much I can do with that besides make him a Batman villain. If you remember something I mentioned way back in episode 3, there was a rumor of a 1930s update to Phantom about a man who has come back from the Great War with the persistent fantasy he has been scarred. Seriously and sensitively treated, a story about an unscarred phantom could be interesting. So where does this leave us in terms of phantom and horror? Is this the last gasp of a slasher genre trying to make bank off a familiar public domain property? Maybe. Kind of. In the end, while the fact of these films' existence is interesting, I'm not sure this type of horror is really where Phantom of the Opera shines best. LaRue's original point is too nuanced to do as straight-up horror, meaning you either don't, or you make Eric into something different than he is. Neither of the Erics in today's episode have a hint of a redemptive quality. That aspect is entirely thrown out once we've established that they're basically killing for fun and not through some sense of aggrievement. One gets the sense that however seriously the people making these films took their work, they weren't attempting to tell a story about the actual ills besetting a man in Eric's predicament, but to thrill audiences with sex and violence. Whether there's a future for Phantom in the horror sphere remains to be seen. A project helmed by Alex Kurtzman of Star Trek reboot fame was announced in 2017 that would bring Eric into Universal's updated Dark Universe shared world of films, starting with Dracula Untold in 2014 and continuing with 2017's yet again remade The Mummy. But the lackluster performance of that film caused a whole slate of announced projects to be shelved, Phantom among them. I don't have particularly high hopes for an MCU-style shared Universal horror universe, mostly because the effort to combine Eric, Dracula, Frankenstein, the creature from the Black Lagoon, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Wolfman, and Quasimodo seems like it would be fated to be awkward from both a plot and thematic standpoint. On the other hand, I'd have been interested to see how current horror trends might manifest in Phantom. Then again, we may need to wait for Phantom's particular brand of social anxiety to come around again. As we'll keep talking about the next 2 episodes, there are several cultural reasons for this story's popularity to wax and wane. I hope you've enjoyed this stroll down the dark streets of horror phantoms. I have 2 planned episodes in the season left. The next is about the 2004 Lloyd Webber movie and the musical sequel, and the final is a wrap-up about the themes and the future of Phantom. Until then, thank you for listening to Readapted. This show was written and produced by me, Chris Pepper Hambrick. If you like the show, please rate and review and tell your friends. And feel free to reach out to me at Readapted Podcast on Gmail, Facebook, or Instagram, or Readapted Pod on Twitter with comments, questions, and suggestions. Until next time, only love and music are forever. See you then.